If there's one series I'd say is overlooked nowadays, one collection that I grew up with for its better entries and its worse ones, if there is one group of films that is so emotionally deep as well as visually stunning, it's the Joel Schumacher Batman movies.
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
Oh wait, no. It's the Planet of the Apes trilogy. Now, of course, this is a reboot/prequel of the original series from the 1970s. That group of 5 films has a great first movie and a pretty okay second movie, in my opinion, and then another trilogy set mostly in the modern day. Spoiler alert, which is the past, and those aren't really as good to me. Maybe one of them's okay, but I can't remember. It's been a while. But after that 5th movie, Tim Burton took on the reins of rebooting the franchise, and hey, not even he liked it. Okay, we'll get there in a second, but I really want to talk about the Planet of the Apes trilogy from the 2010s. This series is genuinely beautiful, a trilogy focusing on a character study of the main character, yes, but also as the character of humanity as a whole. This is what the original film does so well. It holds a mirror up to the worst aspects of our society. However, this trilogy does not only this, but it recontextualizes the worst and best of humanity by showing it at a very extreme point, the end of itself. So I'm embarking on a new quest, one that will not only show why this trilogy is so important to me, but also why it's just really, really good. So just to let you know what the structure of these videos will be, I'm going to be going over the background information, the plot of the film, dissecting the major characters, and then wrapping the video up, talking about the filmmaking, and maybe we'll talk themes at the very, very end of the series. And we'll do that 3 times, hopefully in time for the newest installment in the franchise coming out in a few months, but we'll see if we'll see if I can do that. So without a further ado, let's, as Mario would say, a go. So this whole story begins with French author Pierre Buell's 1963 novel La Planète des Singes. I don't speak Joaquin Phoenix. Taking the spirit of the adventure in the sci-fi novels of the time, Buell categorized his book as social fantasy. The central message of the piece is that human intelligence can atrophy if it is taken for granted. So, as the film rights got sold to 20th Century Fox, RIP, the task to write a screenplay eventually fell to Rod Serling, the creator of The Twilight Zone.
There's a man out there.
What?
Look, he's crawling on...
This screenplay introduced the famous twist ending that the Planet of the Apes was actually a future Earth and that had been destroyed through nuclear warfare. This is a reference to a common fear at every point in time since the nuclear bomb was invented. After some changes were made to that script by Michael Wilson of Bridge on the River Kwai frame, that made the ape society more primitive as a way of saving costs and also rewrote some of the plot too. So the film was made, becoming one of the most iconic films of the 1960s, making 4 times its budget and being critically acclaimed as well. And the sequel, while earning worse reviews, made just as much money as the first one, and even though the world ends at the end of the second Planet of the Apes movie, well, you know, it made money, so time for a third. The third movie had a budget about half that of the previous film, and while it critically was better than the second film in the series, it didn't do too hot monetarily. Like, it just about made back its money. And then the 4th and the 5th films came out and their budget was slashed again, and again, it didn't really do too well in theaters in terms of money and or the critics. So they were like, okay, the 5th one, this is the last one, we're donesies. So the series ended on a bust, and there it lied until a TV show came out in like 1974, and I think it ran for a couple years. We're going to skip that, it's not super important, but we do need to talk really quickly about the reboot from 2001. So since the 1980s, Fox wanted to reboot this series, but they weren't really able to get anything off the ground for 15 years, and they skipped directors such as Christopher Columbus and James Cameron of Avatar, The Way of Water fame.
This stuff just happens to stop human aging.
But eventually it all landed on the shoulders of Tim Burton. Due to the arduous production just demanding that the film come out on a specific date, Tim Burton was not having it. He was not in the mood to make this movie. And even though the film earned 3 times its budget, Burton was like, no, I am not coming back and doing another one. And after that, any sequel idea just kind of died off. Until about 2005. A reboot that can softly fit into the established franchise was written by Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver. They took some elements from the first 5 movies and kind of incorporated that into the world building. From there, lead creatives went in and out until the film eventually landed on Rupert Wyatt to direct. And from there, a pretty standard production took place. It earned 5 times its original budget. And it just so happens that it was critically successful as well. Okay, I know that was a lot. I didn't really want to focus on the background too much, but we had to cover like 60 years of history, so, you just had to bear with me there. Anyways, let's talk about the plot for those who haven't seen the movie in a while. The film opens at Genesis, a genetic therapy pharmaceutical company. Oh boy. A female ape known as Bright Eyes has been given the drug ALZ-112 and has shown considerable progress. Will Rodman talks to his boss, Steve Jacobs, and convinces him that he has the data to enable them to proceed with human trials for the drug. The next day, Rodman and Jacobs appear before the board of directors. Will explains that the new drug causes neurogenesis, a growth of new brain cells that may heal any number of degenerative brain disorders such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. The only side effect is that the subjects exposed to the drug have a green sparkle in their eye. Back in the lab, Bright Eyes acts aggressively towards the helpers. They try to wrangle her with a lasso pole. She goes ape shit and runs rampant through the building. The chase ends when she crashes through the glass window of the conference room and the building security guard kills her. Jacobs pronounces the drug project dead. Will attempts to change his mind, but Jacobs refuses, claiming he wants the remainder of the test apes put down. After returning to the lab, Robert shows Will a baby ape hidden in Bright Eyes' cell. Bright Eyes wasn't acting violently because of the drug, but she was in order to protect her child. And then Will decides to take the baby chimp home. Will returns home where he lives with his father, Charles, who suffers from Alzheimer's, and Will shows the baby ape to him. Charles playfully calls the baby Caesar, and it sticks. Alright, that's most of the setup. We're going to kind of pick it up along from here. Pick up 3 years later, and the now half-grown Caesar is a beloved member of the family and shows great intelligence communicating complex ideas with sign language. Meanwhile, Charles's Alzheimer's disease is getting worse, and Will steals ALZ-112 from Genesis. He gives a dose to Charles, and it appears it is a miracle drug, when the next day, Will finds his father sitting at the piano playing perfectly, just as he used to. Also, Caesar escapes out the window into the neighbor's backyard. This frightens the neighbor's daughter, and her father attacks Caesar. Will and Charles manage to rescue him, but not before being injured. Will sneaks Caesar into a zoo for treatment and is treated by a veterinarian named Caroline Arana? During the procedure, Caesar even implies that Will and Caroline should go out to dinner. Later, they take him across the Golden Gate Bridge to a redwood forest, and upon arriving at the forest, Caesar will not leave Will. He makes a supplication gesture asking for permission to play. Will gives him permission, and then Caesar goes and plays. Another time jump, 5 years later, Caroline is living as part of the Rodman family, and Caesar has grown pretty substantially here. Will notices that Caesar seems sad and confused about just what he is. They drive to Genesis, and Will explains the drug that made him more intelligent, as well as the death of his mother. Charles's condition also has deteriorated even more, Will reasoning that his immune system has developed antibodies and a more aggressive virus is needed. Will goes to Jacobs confessing his secret experiment with his father and says he has reworked the virus and needs Jacobs to approve new animal testing. Back at home, Charles gets confused and wanders outside and into the neighbor's car. He attempts to drive it but ends up damaging it. That one guy from earlier pulls Charles from the car, but he is unable to convey his reasons for being there. Caesar watches this from his window in the attic and rushes out of the house, attacking that one guy, ending with him biting off a finger. Charles gets Caesar to back off, but the incident causes Caesar to be taken to a primate sanctuary by animal control. Will and Caroline walk him in and say goodbye in a pretty heartbreaking scene.
Coming back soon. Okay?
The sanctuary is run by John Landon, with the care of the animals supervised by Dodge Landon and Rodney. When Caesar flings his food at Dodge and laughs, he turns a fire hose on him. Caesar later meets the alpha male of the group, Rocket, who tears off Caesar's shirt and beats him. Caesar also meets a gorilla named Buck and an orangutan, Maurice, across from his cage, who also speaks sign language. The Sanctuary ships 12 apes to Genesis for the testing of the newer version of ALZ-112, which is named ALZ-113. Will chooses Koba as his first subject. Koba is given the new drug through a breathing mask. However, the hose comes off the machine and Robert is accidentally exposed. That night, Will takes some of the ALZ-113 home to treat his father. Charles refuses the treatment and dies in his sleep. Later, Dodge brings some of his friends into the cage area at the sanctuary, where Caesar manages to steal a pocket knife from one of the visitors. Caesar befriends the large gorilla in the yard by letting him loose, and then he releases Rocket and hits him with a steel gas can. Rocket is ready to fight but realizes that Buck is loyal to Caesar and will protect him, so Rocket submits. Caesar is now the alpha male. Caesar later lets Rocket out of the cage area and allows him to give stolen cookies to each ape, bonding them all together. Will returns to work where he finds that Jacobs has pushed the research schedule ahead. Will warns him that a major hurdle they need to worry about is how the newer ALZ-113 will affect humans. Jacobs refuses to listen and Will quits Genesis. Meanwhile, Robert has been experiencing side effects from his exposure to the virus from Koba. Will returns to the ape sanctuary and attempts to bribe the owner into letting him have Caesar. John is willing to do so, but Caesar refuses, staying with the apes. That evening, Caesar steals the ALZ-113 from Will's refrigerator and gives it to the apes at the preserve. The next day, the owner observes the apes having something like a conference, and it's really kind of creepy. That night, the apes are returning to their cages, but Caesar refuses, confronting Dodge. Then this happens as a response to, "Take your paws off me, you damn dirty ape." Oh my gosh, that was like one of the best things to watch in the theater, by the way. Ooh, chilling. The other caretaker is placed into Caesar's cage as a show of mercy. Dodge tries to escape and he gets electrocuted. Avada Kedavra, bitch. At dawn, Will calls to check on Caesar but receives no answer. Driving over to investigate, he finds the apes gone and the ALZ-113 canisters open in the cage areas. So he lets a few people know about the smart monkeys who are walking around now. Speaking of which, the apes are making their way across town and Caesar divides them into two groups. Buck goes with one group to the zoo while Caesar leads the second group to Genesis. Oh, and also Robert dies later, but whatever. Jacobs arrives at work to find that Caesar and the other apes have taken over the building and freed the 12 ALZ-113 test subjects. And the police are called in. Jacobs boards a police helicopter as Caesar and Buck's groups join forces with the apes, intentionally preventing the deaths of humans when they can. Will and Caroline hear about the rampage and figure out that Caesar is leading the apes to the redwood forest. The police are waiting on the bridge to fire on the apes, but Caesar divides them into one group that climbs the suspension cables and another one that swings from the underside of the structure. The helicopter Jacobs is on targets Caesar, but hovers too low and Buck leaps onto it, bringing it and himself down. Caesar finds Jacobs pleading for help on the other side of the bridge. Instead, Caesar turns away, and whether he knows it or not, Koba pushes the helicopter off, killing Jacobs upon impact with the water. The apes proceed into the forest as Will and Caroline steal a police car heading towards them. He calls out Caesar's name and Caesar appears, the others backing away. Will attempts to reconcile with him, promising that if Caesar comes home with him, he'll protect him. Caesar shocks Will by holding him close and whispering, "Caesar is home." Will watches, somewhat at peace, knowing that Caesar has found his pack, for lack of a better word, whatever a group of monkeys is called, I don't know, as Caesar and several other apes climb up into the trees and survey the forest. In the mid-credits scene, we see that one guy from earlier was reporting for duty as a pilot at San Francisco International Airport. And like any other person who bleeds through their nose, the guy shows up to work and spreads the deadly virus all around the world, killing almost everybody. But we don't know that yet. Well, now's as good a time as any to talk about the characters in this film. Firstly, we have Steve Jacobs, the head of Genesis. Obviously, he functions vitally in the setup of the plot, but as the story progresses, he keeps getting reinserted into the film in ways that wouldn't necessarily need his inclusion. Part of this is just to bring him to the climax so we have a specific face to root against, and if they didn't include him throughout the film, that face would kind of mean nothing by the end. However, the really interesting part of his character is in his link to nearsighted greed. I spoke about greed in my video on The Last Crusade, which you should check out, by the way. It's link probably in one of these corners if I remember to do it. But in this instance, this version of greed is different from Elsa's or Donovan's. Jacobs runs a company that is all about exclusivity in the market and being on the forefront of innovation. The products of this environment, if unchecked by some form of limits, is this nearsightedness in terms of gratification. Jacobs is this person who balks at risk when the reward is too far ahead of him and pursues reward far too quickly when he sees the end in sight. This is best showcased in his immediate canceling of the ALZ-112 at the film's opening after that one violent test subject out of all the others before getting any sort of report on what happened, as well as his pursuit of the ape Koba. I'm going to talk about him more in the next video, don't worry. What Jacobs does in both these instances is lack any sort of second-order thinking when making decisions about what will bring in money. Now, to be fair, the board of directors could more accurately be characterized as this type of greed, but since we never really see them outside of maybe 20 seconds on screen, Jacobs has to become their face. His experiments on Koba represent part of what the apes are striving to live apart from. The lack of care towards the apes can at least be excused because in his mind, apes are not people, but the question of what it means to be people becomes complicated when you increase an ape's intelligence to the point of them becoming self-conscious. And to be clear, I'm not trying to define personhood at consciousness in terms of like they are able to react to stimuli, that sort of consciousness. I know that's a limited definition, but I don't want to define consciousness there necessarily because that would exclude somebody who's asleep or in a coma or, I don't know, like under the age of 3 or on TikTok, same thing, pretty much. Mentally, no brain. However, what I am saying that when somebody is apparently and obviously conscious, we tend to just view them as more of a person because of that. And this makes Jacob's treatment of the apes inherently morally complicated, whether he knows they are self-conscious or not. But we'll talk about that more in just a second. The point being, Jacobs functions in the plot, yes, but we also call into question certain ethics that will come to define this series specifically through his nearsighted greed. Something tells me this idea is going to come up more and more in this retrospective series. The second character we should look at is Alchemy. No, wait, sorry. What a bad show. It's Dodge Landon. Not only does this character get 2 iconic lines from the original, "It's a madhouse!"
Stinking paws off me,
You damn dirty ape. That's not even remotely what he sounded like. But he also is the little shithead of the film. And I mean that in the technical sense. This character has absolutely no redeeming qualities. And unlike Jacobs, who is at least motivated by something neutral like money that he kind of corrupts, Dodge is seemingly single-handedly motivated by a need to torture these apes. Now, I don't know his backstory, but it can be assumed that since his dad either owns or runs the place, or both, I don't know, that he would have spent a lot of time at this center while he was growing up. It's also true that we see him at the ape sanctuary at night at least once outside of the time he was clearly just sneaking in to impress some girls, I guess. So along with some dialogue he says throughout the film, we have to assume that he genuinely hates this place. And he may even resent his father too for having him work at this place all his life, always smelling the apes, always having to hear their screams and all the monkey noises, always having to miss out on other things happening just to keep the business afloat. Okay, I kind of added that last one, but it's not impossible to see that as a possible backstory for him. This backstory would explain his cruelty towards the apes, but regardless of whether this headcanon is real canon or not, doesn't change the fact of his behavior. And looking at the psychopathic behavior, it's clear that Dodge represents the animal-like nature that is a part of the worst of humanity. You know, there is an argument to the idea that every person has a dark side, and it's what classifies good people as good when they keep that dark side from getting out. However, for our purposes here, we'll just conclude that there are some bad people that anybody could be, but it's not a part of every person, if that makes sense. The reason for this distinction is because most of the human characters in this series represent a certain type of person or a certain aspect of humanity. Dodge, like I said, being this animalistic side of humanity, pairs with the thread of greed that comes from the other antagonist to the apes. And by grappling with this two-person split in antagonistic personalities, we get a fuller picture of what the film says causes rebellion. I'll talk about rebellion from the positive side here in a second, but the film is essentially positing that the two types of people who cause rebellion are those who are sadistic and those who are greedy. The sadistic one makes a lot of sense, obviously, as it would see its form as a tyrant or abuser or something similar to that. However, the greed one is interesting too. I think greed is the root of all other wrongs that a person may commit, as another word for greed is just selfishness. So the film saying that rebellion comes from sadistic and selfish abuse is a really interesting use of these characters to convey a strong message. I think the film excels at this portrayal of the worst parts of humanity, even without, specifically in Jacob's case, making the characters completely irredeemable. And as for why there are two representations as opposed to one, I mean, if selfishness is the root of all wrong, then you only need one, that probably comes down to the idea that sadism, and more broadly, evil, comes not from the self, but from something else entirely. Maybe even someone else. And before you think I'm jumping the gun with vague allusions to religious ideology, stick with me because this series actually has a lot of religious ideology and religious stories kind of meshed together into its narrative. But before we get into that and all the other things that I promise we're going to get to in a second, we got one more character to get through. Will Rodman has been working for 6 years at Genesis on the ALZ-112 drug. His last name being derived from Rod Sterling, the guy who wrote that first screenplay for the first film in the franchise, is a cool nod to the legacy of these films. But what's more interesting to know is the original ending of this film saw Will going to the Apes sanctuary to kill Caesar as a way to end the bloodshed after he believed Caesar murdered the other guy who ran the lab. However, another ape who would actually become the wife of Caesar in the real sequel eats a poison cookie that Will was going to give Caesar, and then Will learns that it was actually Koba who killed that lab guy. Then Will goes to the Redwood Forest to negotiate with Caesar, but the police follow him in, and Will eventually dies, taking a bullet for Caesar. Then that ending was modified that the sanctuary owner follows Will into the forest with a shotgun, and Will dies protecting Caesar, which I think is interesting, but either way, I'm glad they changed this ending. Not only does that version of the movie end on a major downer, but it specifically misses the point of who the protagonist is. The brilliance of this film is how they mix the human and ape characters into the plot without making the point of view that of just the human characters. Caesar is the lead of the film, even if the initial lead is the human character of Will. Just like how the world transitions from humans on top to apes on top, so too does the structure of the film present the same idea, with apes getting more and more screen time and screen development as the film progresses. Now, all that to be said, as to the character of Will Rodman, there's only one interesting thing that I think the movie presents here, and that is the uncompromising pursuit of helping the ones you love. It's not that Will lacks empathy for others or that he even pursues his goal to the detriment of any other relationship. The film could have easily made his pursuit single-minded, destroying all his other relationships to save that one that is dying. But they explicitly didn't choose that path, and I think the film is better for that. See, Will's function in the theme of the film is to show Caesar that not all humans are bad. Hashtag not all humans. It's the relationship with Will that comes to define not only the central emotional core of this film, but also a lot of the conflict internally and externally of the rest of the trilogy. Will cares for Caesar, both in the physical sense as well as in the emotional sense. The best example of this is the first night when he's taking care of the chimp in the bathroom. That look of exhaustion, but also of fear on his face, paired with the action of caring for him in the middle of the night. That's just a lovely idea expressed all visually. This character wants the best for those he loves, even if he is wrong about what's best for them. This is shown not only in Caesar, but also in his father, who is ailing from Alzheimer's. He's able to bring his father back from his mentally corrupted state, but at the end, his father has one last point of lucidity and tells him to stop. This seals his father's fate, and I think both of them know that at that point. The reason being, Will's father does not want to continue to lose his faculties at such a degradation that it borders on the humiliating, and he's just ready to die. Obviously, that's not what Will wants, but that's exactly the point. That's why Will represents the best of humanity in all of its flawed nature. And it's the same with Caesar. Will wants to protect him, putting Caesar in a collar when outside, dressing him like a human, keeping him in a small house away from others. This does keep Caesar safe, prolonging his life, but it doesn't address the fundamental desire for freedom and purpose for the sentient creature. This frustrates Caesar to his core, and even though he obviously loves Will, When Will comes to him in the forest with the collar, promising to take him home and keep him safe, Caesar has to refuse. The point is, while Will is a good person, I mean, we can see this in how his relationship with Caroline progresses over a few years, he is still not perfect. He's human. And one day, maybe the apes are going to learn how human they really are too. Alright, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the main monkey now. Okay, where to begin? Well, perhaps the quickest and most all-encompassing way we can describe Caesar in this film is that he represents the spirit of righteous rebellion. See, it's not just enough to say rebellion, as to rebel against a force is neutral as an identifier. You can rebel against the Empire from Star Wars, and you can rebel against your parents when you're a teenager. In both cases, the amount of control that that force has over you is equal as a source that compels you, as far as you can identify an antagonistic source. The difference is that even if both want the best, one wants the best for itself, and one wants the best for you. Righteous rebellion is rebellion against a source that wants the best for itself without regard to whether it will further your individual prosperity in a physical or emotional sense. This force is Caesar. Even though he was raised by a human who did want the best for him, it was nearly every other person, certainly those who did not try to know him, who had little regard for his well-being, especially at the cost of their own. Now, this gets tricky because most people aren't going to place animals on the same level of care as a human being, even if they wouldn't seek to go out of their way to abuse the animal. And, we can't really fault this assumption, but this is something that a sentient creature outside of the human race would absolutely disagree with good reason. And this, I believe, offers a description of the type of rebellion depicted in this film. And this pairs well with what I find really interesting about this trilogy, and even if it's less so in this film, it is clearly meant to be surmised, and that is the religious nature of Caesar's character. The spirit of rebellion runs through the creation of the monotheistic religions of the world, from a rebellion against the pantheistic, paganistic, idol-worshipping of the wider world in the religion of Judaism, or the rebellion against the practice of trumping the spirit of religious calling in Christianity, and maybe also rebellion against paganism with Islam? I'm not too familiar with that one, but we're going to assume that that tradition holds in my thesis, because otherwise I'd have to change my thesis. I'm a scientist. Anyway, it is this spirit that defines the protagonist of this film. We're given hints of this too. Visually, there's an outstretched hand that the apes use to show submission, which is sort of a twist on the outstretched hand associated with worship. And in terms of setup, Caesar is named after that one Julius guy, I forget his last name. The Caesar of Rome was often deified, both when they commanded their subjects to worship them and when the subjects willingly chose to do so. Both of these place the protagonist in the position of being an almost messianic figure for the apes, which leads me to the religious aspect depicted in the narrative. The apes are in captivity, quite literally, but also in their own ignorance, and throughout the narrative, Caesar brings them out of it in a way that not only opens their eyes, but only results in violence against select people, namely those who respond to their leaving with force. This leaving of captivity for a place of glory is very reminiscent of the Exodus story, placing Caesar as the Moses figure of the series. We get more explicit echoes of this in the later entries, but it certainly bears at least a mention here. But for the purposes of the series that we're doing, I think the best way to look at this movie is that it functions in some way of a sort of retelling of the Garden of Eden, demystifying it. There's an idea in those first few chapters of Genesis that Adam and Eve in that story were very childlike initially, and it is through eating the apple that they suddenly recognize their nakedness or their vulnerability, and they are pushed out of the garden and into the real world. I think an interpretation of the story can be the story of gaining consciousness, or something similar to becoming awake to the realities and the complexities of life, i.e. becoming an adult. Caesar is given the ALZ 112, or, for our purposes here, the apple, without his consent, and he grows up to the point of recognizing the problems of the human society for him and his kind, which is essentially and physically when he becomes an adult. This is all well and good, however, he also gives the apples to the other apes without their consent, thus awakening them to adulthood in the process. This can all be broken down and dissected in many interesting ways, like how Koba does not get awakened by Caesar and how that plays into the next film, and how the serpent figure is originally the humans, even if there is no trick being played. But then the myth gets converted into the deified figure himself giving out the apple. And then there's also maybe a commentary on how intelligence shouldn't be asked for, it should be given, because you might not know to ask for it. Again, this can get really complex and interesting, but I think it's best to leave this up to you to consider more, as this video is already getting long enough as it is. However, I will say that all myths are created for the purpose of explaining something naturally occurring, whether that be human nature or physical nature, and all myths are told within the certain context of that culture, thus changing its presentation and even its message. The point is that there is a point in changing things around, and whatever it seems to be saying is done so with the agenda of taking big ideas and turning them into a narrative that somebody may be able to understand the lesson from, if not every single detail about. Alright, well that's enough about these characters. Let's round out this video by talking about the filmmaking, because oh boy. First things first, I'm a realist. The film was shot on 35mm stock and later converted into digital for the post-production, which is kind of odd for this time because most productions were turning digital by the mid to late 2000s, so I just found that kind of interesting. It also kind of accounts for the grainy look of the film, which could just be the downgraded Blu-ray copy that I was watching, but I just thought that mentioned a note. Also, this film was shot in Canada, mostly on a soundstage, but there were some scenes that were taking place on location and out and about. But the real reason I wanted to give a special section out for the filmmaking is, in particular, the special effects. It's not that the direction isn't well done or anything, it really is just that these special effects, when paired with phenomenal performance, were groundbreaking. This was the first film to feature a near photorealistic character at the emotional center of the film, at least according to Weta's website. Apparently they considered using real apes before moving to creating them digitally, and I honestly can't imagine they stayed on that idea for more than a day, because how the hell would you do this with a real monkey? But it was the advancements in motion capture technology after major characters using it in movies such as Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Then you have the real-time capturing of that motion capture data in Lord of the Rings The Two Towers with Gollum. And there were many other advancements and uses in movies like The Polar Express and Avatar, and that all led to what we got in Rise of the Planet of the Apes. It was actually during this film that they developed a camera that was able to track those motion capture dots in real time and in daylight, which was the only way they were able to do the battle on the Golden Gate Bridge. There were also huge advancements in terms of the way muscles moved and were animated to go from a human face to a chimpanzee face, as well as in the detail and depth of the eyes. And let me tell you, these advancements show. I said earlier that the CGI is near photorealistic, and that's because there are some shots in particular that don't look all the way real, kind of hit the uncanny valley area. Part of this could be the use of shooting in film, then converting to digital, and then rendering that CGI, and then releasing in a lower than 4K quality, but the vast majority of the movie looks absolutely real. It's genuinely amazing what they were able to accomplish in just 2011, 7 years before Infinity War gave us photoreal Thanos. And again, I could talk about the direction in this film, but I think I want to save that for the sequels, because Matt Reeves directs the sequels, and he's pretty neat. Well, look at us. We took a good look at this film, and I think I have a greater appreciation for it than I did before. I want to state that this film is the weakest film in the trilogy easily, and even then, it's still probably like a solid 8 out of 10. Look, to be fair, human characters in this film are not the most exciting to watch, and they probably are a bit one note. I think what makes them interesting is the way this almost modern mythological story uses these characters as a sort of archetype. At least they're an archetype once you remove some unnecessary bits and then squint a little, but it uses them to facilitate a message that resonates with the emotional core of the main character. And you know, I think that's good enough. Better than most other movies made today, but you guys already know my thoughts on that because you've already seen the other video essay that we put out last month. But you know, I think this is a good place to end the video today. I'm hoping to get this 3-part series over by the time of Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes releases, but we'll see if that happens, who knows. Regardless, thank you all for watching this video. Hit the subscribe button if you want. Like the video if that's something you do. I never do it, but whatever. And let me know what you thought of this movie. Did you see it when it came out? Are you a newcomer to the series? Let me know in the comments. Anyways, I've been Kyle, and I still am, and this has been a retrospective on Rise of the Planet of the Apes.